Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for being with us again. This is the outline for the session. I'll get a brief welcome here, and then Jim and Pierre will tackle engaging stakeholders, governing strategy. We'll leave time for Q&A and any closing remarks at the end. Next slide. One more. So just
Hello?
a reminder for
Hello?
those of you that
Hello?
have
Hello?
Just a reminder for those of you that have worked with us in the past, we're updating our framework, and it will include these three new topics of transformation, engagement, and governance. We've already covered the transformation piece, and Jim and Pierre will cover governance and engagement. We'll be incorporating all of this into the next round of our courses that will begin after the first of the year. So with that, let me turn this over to you, Jim and Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And as a reminder, if you can keep yourselves microphone on mute, so we could have some bandwidth as we grow more participants as we do. So today, we're going to talk about engaged stakeholders, key concepts, and key activities. There's a lot of key concepts to cover, and I really kind of did a tearing down of all the details we have in the written body of knowledge, but hopefully this will wet your whistle for reading more in the body of knowledge if you haven't gotten a copy of it yet. And then we'll close out the next 20 minutes talking about the key activities. And as a reminder, as Pierre kicked us off 2 weeks ago, engaged stakeholders is going on throughout the strategic management lifecycle. And we'll talk about how that interacts with the other concept that we'll cover this morning, or this afternoon, is governance. So these are the big concepts that we wanted to talk about. Prior to the call, one of our participants, Woody Stanley, who runs our government community of practice here for IASP, was talking about how Body of Knowledge 2.0 had a lot of leadership, and it had a lot of theory, a lot of different theories on it. We tried to make sure that we're talking about practical aspects of the leader's role in managing strategy. Then we'll talk about organizational culture, and that is because, and when we did our job task analysis 3.5 years ago now, our practitioners told us that they were asked and always challenged to help their clients or their organization themselves to build an organization that's full of trust, features psychological safety, and is agile in its activities. And we'll close out this day with some stuff on groups facilitation, teamwork, and incentives. So many definitions of leadership. We could probably do a 3 or 5 day course on leadership. That's not the intent. One way of looking at leadership that we have as a formal definition in the body of knowledge is it's the art of influencing others to achieve their maximum performance for a common goal. So leaders in our context intentionally develops that culture that supports achievement of that strategic vision that you're going to be developing throughout the process. We also face that or understand that leadership must have some emotional intelligence. They must be self-aware, and they must exude understanding and empathy for the people that they're leading. In doing so, they are going to be acting as a direction setter, a change agent, and a spokesperson acting as the chief advocate or negotiator for the vision. And they're going to be a coach in the context here. Now, there's, like I said, I teach another leadership course and everyone has a different spin on it, but these are things that we found in our research that was critical for managing the strategic management lifecycle. Okay, there we go. And so, and this is in more detail in the body of knowledge, but leadership entails what we summed up as 5 key activities. Challenging the process by searching for opportunities for experimentation, and a degree of risk-taking. They need to inspire with a shared vision of what the future might be and enlisting others in that shared vision. Enabling others to act by fostering collaboration and strengthening others. We've also found that leaders need to model the way, especially in the area of psychological safety, that we'll go to in a few minutes. And then often overlooked is the aspect of encouraging the heart by recognizing individual contribution and, of course, celebrating achievements. We see leaders having a passion for a vocation or a profession as a course of action. They're good communicators. Everyone's going to have a way of communicating, and understanding that way will help a strategist, whether at the SPP level or the SMP level, understand how to leverage the leaders in the organization. And lastly, down there we say daring, which includes learning from adversity, especially during the pandemic. And our research was prior pandemic, but it was really foreboding on the role of leaders to be able to model behavior, take action, and not, and my colleague says fail is first attempt at institutional learning. So it's a positive spin on of failure. That was taking the risks, what you need to do. Now, if a role of leader, one of the roles is to build that organizational culture. And we'll talk about one of the shining stars on organizational culture over the last 40 or 50 years in a second or two. But a definition is that an organizational culture is as expressed, implied norms, customs, beliefs, assumptions, and expectations of how employees, leaders, and others contribute in the organization. So as such, it guides group behaviors, what's acceptable and not acceptable. When culture, organizational values, and personal values align, the result is a really good, vibrant organization. So culture should be shared, it should be permeating, enduring, implicit, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So let's look at the next slide. On the right-hand side is a graphic based on Ed Sheen's work on organizational culture. And he says, organizational culture at the highest level, the ones that are outside or external to the organization, is those artifacts, the branding, the symbols, the way that your office, if you have an office or a building, or the way that your factory work, those are elements of an organizational culture. Then at the next lowest level, it's those espoused values that the leaders help to shape. And at the core, it's those underlying assumptions. And it's really driven by the leaders. For a new organization or an entrepreneur venturing out into a new organization, that leader is going to play a big role in shaping the organizational culture. And the organizational culture will change over time as either leaders change or other key individuals that play there. So the other level of culture is that you could have different cultures within one organization, meaning you can have subcultures. You can have the culture of, say, Google, and then you take a sub-organization of Google, that may have a slight variation on that, and even project teams may have a subset or sub-variation on the culture as well. Again, organizational culture, you could probably take a 5-day course on that, and we're just trying to get the key elements that we found in our research and why it's important to understand how to work with culture, because you probably have heard, culture eats strategy for breakfast, which is Peter Drucker's famous quote. So it's really important to understand what the culture is and how you can build in agile practices, which is the ability to sense and respond to things happening not only externally, but also internally in a timely manner and taking appropriate action. Trust is also a very key component of organizational culture and is a key aspect of psychological safety. So one way of looking at trust is it's a confident belief in the safety, fortitude, integrity, or reliability, truth, and ability of someone or something. And that's at an individual level. At an organizational level, it's the positive expectations that individuals have about the organizational members based on roles, relationships, and interdependencies. It is key for essentially employee engagement. And that's why we focused on trust and organizational trust in the engaged strategy component of the body of knowledge. If you have organizational trust, we have found that it helps people manage complexity, fosters a capacity, allows collaboration, and increase organizational learning. One of my colleagues wrote a book called The Trusted Advisor several years ago, and it's a chock-a-block full of research and techniques to improve organizational trust. And it's a two-way street. It's just not, I trust you. You got to validate that trust because it does really impact how an organization is healthy and functions well. And if you're interested in that, I could put that in chat when Pierre is speaking of that. It's really geared towards consultants or internal consultants, as the case may be. So research from Zach, he proposes 8 ways that organizations can build a culture of trust. And these are not rocket science here, but recognize excellence, recognize contributions, induce challenge stress, moderate stress caused by, difficult but yet attainable goals and activities. Empower the employees to choose their work patterns and habits, and that's a key aspect of agility. Give employees a voice in their own job design. Communicate often, intentionally build relationships, and show vulnerability. And that's also another important aspect of psychological safety. And the reference for Zach is in the written body of knowledge. So I talked about psychological safety several times now this afternoon. One definition, it's the being able to show and employ oneself without fear of consequences of self-image, status, or career. It's a shared belief that the team or individual is taking interpersonal risk. It's also a climate that people believe that they can freely float any idea, ask any kind of question, voice any concern without fear of retribution. And when you have psychological safety, team members accept and respect each other and recognizing that they can have differing opinions. Research from several contributors to some of the programs that LBL does have found that psychological safety allows teams and organizations to perform, learn, and innovate. It's present when people are feeling comfortable being vulnerable, not asking a stupid question. When I used to teach a facilitation course many years ago, I used one of these slides that was an old cartoon that showed the complete opposite of psychological safety, and got chuckles from the people going through the program. The other key point, and this is why we're talking about this in the context of it's the role of the senior leaders in management to foster, create, and maintain a culture of psychological safety. You can't do Agile without psychological safety. Okay, so some people have said, and you may have heard it from Randy, that a new strategy is just a hypothesis ready to be tested, right? And a new strategy could be a change from the current strategy, especially in the time of COVID when people had to change how they operated, if they could do that, spin on the dime, if you will. So organizational change management is the practice of applying a structured approach to go from that current state to that future state. So when you're doing a formulate strategy and you do the transform the organization to align the operating model to the new strategy, you're actually creating change, and you need to manage that transition from the current to the new, from the new strategy to the current strategy to the new strategy, from the new operating model that is aligned with the new strategy. So it relies on a team that has established the over context for change, provides guidance, stimulates conversation, provides the resources to make that change, that new operating model, that new strategy realistic, helps to coordinate align projects throughout the strategic management lifecycle. It should ensure congruence of the messages so that you get the same message of why this new strategy should be reinforced by policies and behaviors that are modeled by leaders. And this key aspect of Agile is the opportunity for joint creation, anticipating, identifying, and addressing any people problems, and preparing the critical mass for acceptance of that new strategy. So that's at an organizational level. On a personal level, Change management can be seen as also application of structured process instead of tools to make sure that people are aware of the new strategy and the why of the new strategy, to help them provide them with an understanding of why you're making that change in strategy. Tools to help individuals accept that strategy based on their understanding, and then tools to help them commit to a new way of operating. And we found through our research that the role of a strategist is to build and change management into formulate, transform from the start. In fact, if you've taken the LBL SMPS course, they talk about organization and doing a check on what are the elements that you have in place. And I, as a trained and certified change management professional, I know that's part of the process that I've always gone through once I really clicked on what this was 30 plus years ago. So there's two components. How do you move the organization, get them all aligned, aware of the new strategy, why you're doing some transformation activities, why you're changing one or more elements of the operating model to be aligned, and also on the personal side. And in the next version, we'll have some techniques you probably have heard of ADKAR, which is a pro-sci approach to individual change. You may hear of the Kubler-Ross change acceptance curve. We talk about that in the tool section of the body of knowledge coming out soon. And there's stakeholders. And so one of the key aspects of engagement is knowing which are those stakeholders that has an interest or a role in either the formulation of that strategy, transforming the organization, and execution of that strategy. So we believe that you need to identify those stakeholders, analyze where they are, where they might be, where you might need to help move them. You know, they may be only at the awareness level, but they're not really committed. So how do you help get that commitment? There's tools to help map the stakeholders. I did a large project for the Royal Bank of Canada many years ago that we used just spreadsheets to make sure that we kept, and this is a big change for their culture, and we just kept and maintained that. Plan implementation, reporting progress. And one of the things that is really important is listening. Listening to if the message is getting through, what people aren't getting, what they need more of, and you can do that in a 90-second checkout when you're doing a presentation to a group of individuals. Say, what did you hear? What didn't you hear? What do you need to know more of? You take that back and say, okay, how do we have to change our plan? How are we doing? How are we bringing those bodies away? I was working at Ford Motor Company, trying to change the entire way that the engineers and the procurement people and the manufacturing people and the service people worked to get what they would call job one when they got that new vehicle off the assembly line. And they sent a representative who wanted to understand what was going on because they wanted to sabotage the new decisions that this new system was going to be doing, the new processes was going to be doing. And it was really kind of fun to watch that unfold because we knew about it. We were aware of it because we did an analysis of those stakeholder groups. We knew where we needed to pay attention to. Okay, kind of wrapping up on this end. So an incentive is something that motivates or drives one to do something or behave. So you all probably have seen research that says employees value rewards and recognition more than, say, money. But that could be one of those motivators. Rewarding and recognizing behaviors and accomplishments, making sure values are aligned to the vision. That's part of the strategic management process that you need to be aware of. And we found that even in government organizations, at least my experience, you can have incentives to help motivate government employees to the new outcome you're trying to achieve. If you followed some of the concepts on the previous page by giving them opportunity to influence the outcome, by having them on the team, having them become advocates for that change when they're going back out to the regular work group, if you will. There's all kinds of ways that building up on what we talked about in leadership, change management, and stakeholder management to create that, foster agility, foster psychological safety. And I won't go over what teamwork is. I think everyone on this call knows that, as well as what collaboration is, some basic definitions. In Body of Knowledge 3.0, we do have a section call-out box about virtual facilitation, since that's what a lot of folks are doing these days. I wrote a white paper for IASP's The Strategic Edge back in 2018, prior to the pandemic, about best practices to run virtual strategic planning sessions. This is based on some work I was doing with a DC area nonprofit. So I think we've all learned how to do Zoom, or I'm teaching Teams to myself, because I'm going to be doing some of that in the next coming weeks with another client. But there are other tools. Back in 2018, we didn't even know what Zoom was. We were using some WebEx and GoToMeeting kind of software. Many other software tools out there for collaboration, virtually or in person, including Miro and a whole bunch of other tools that keep on coming up. So a strategist, and from my experience, needs to understand how to use those tools. They may not be the perfect expert in executing, and that's why you need to understand what kind of tools works for your organization or your client's organization, and collaborate effectively as you can. So group facilitation, when I was learning facilitation back almost 40 years ago now, some people view facilitation as a process and making sure that the process is going, but there's also structure. So how are rules followed? What's the pace of your strategy sessions? How much direction is provided? And this is where the Kersey Bates and other kinds of leadership styles to adjust as you're going, in terms of how much direction is required. I was working with Richard and another consultant in an offsite back in July with this board of directors. And these are business owners, small business, medium-sized business owners, or leaders in their respective organizations. And we had 3 breakout groups, and I gave them a little teaching prior to going to the breakouts. And I get someone to really take up the mantle of directing the group. And one person just knew how to do it. He didn't need much direction, because he was a seasoned business professional and did a great job of facilitating that breakout group, which made my job easier, because I can walk around to the other breakouts to make sure everyone was on the same track. There was a number of things on here that good facilitators keep in mind: tracking the timeline, making sure you're reaching your objectives in the allocated time, making sure all attendees are engaged, fully participating. How do you draw out people who have been quiet? How do you tamp down people who might be overly talkative? I used to have all kinds of little characters that I did in some facilitation training many years ago. I'm going to be training a group of moderators, if you will, for a session we're going to do next week. And I have to not only teach them how to use Teams and the breakout function in Teams and the templates that Teams has for brainstorming, for pros and cons discussions, but I also have to help them keep these things on track so they know how to manage the engagement. So people who attend virtually or in person feel that they had an opportunity to influence the outcome of that particular group. Okay, so those are the key concepts I rushed through. Let's go over what we call as 4 key sets of activities. Establish and maintain a sense of urgency, build and implement an engagement operating model, develop communication, stakeholder management, and engagement plans, engage those stakeholders based on those plans, and as I suggested earlier, based on what you heard and the feedback, continuously improve. So, today I think people heard of the acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times. In order to break down, one way to break down resistance to change or that new strategy is to develop that sense of urgency. Back in the 90s, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Collins wrote a book about the burning platform. The imagery of an oil rig on fire in the middle of the Gulf or the middle of the North Sea, I think was the example that they used. When you have your platform is burning, you need to have a sense of urgency to take action. But you can also, depending on your culture's risk-taking appetite, you could take some small risk. You can manage a crisis, bring in outside consultants, stimulate discussion and action, and just keep on ongoing communication about the need for urgency. One of my clients, we had the head of the retail bank, and they're trying to bring in new technology, and it was really going to be a game changer for them vis-a-vis their competitors. And the leader came in and said, it's one of my top 3 priorities. Deflated the 30-person team in the room because he didn't say this was the most important thing that I want you to focus on. After he left to go on to something else, his second in charge was able to quickly spin what he said in order to maintain that sense of, yeah, this is an important project. So maintaining that sense of urgency. Engagement operating model. So there's many different ways, but you need to know what the capabilities are, what the structure, roles, activities to foster change and properly engage employees throughout the organization. It could be different. I was working on a long-term, it was supposed to be a 10-year project, and this was in the wake of 9/11. Wanted to have a secure way of communicating with first responders. And I had to build a plan on how to train people on the 3rd shift, all shifts, so everyone got the same kind of training. And how do you do that in a very effective way that doesn't get in the way of people coming on the shift or coming off shift? And I had to plan that out for 10 years. It was, just a swag, but it was something that I had to do to recognize that for some businesses, not everyone is working 9 to 5, if you will. And there's various methodologies and techniques to support all facets of stakeholder engagement that we are adding into the next iteration of BOK 3.0. So we believe strategy professionals can play a key role in guiding that coalition of engagement and of change. Very early on, and we talk about this in the LBL training, that you got to secure commitment for the top of the house for the resources, not only for just the formulation, but for the entire strategy lifecycle. You got to get resources for those transform activities that Pierre talked about last week. You have to make sure there's resources and training and other resources, whether physical plant resources, technology resources, etc., for the execution, so you can actually execute once you've aligned the organization to that new strategy. So you want to listen and probe to identify leaders' goals, to set that up front, make sure that you are identifying what needs to be changed, determine how the changes may cross various stakeholder groups, and define what that planning horizon. When I was doing this 10 years ago, the planning horizon was 5 to 7 years, and it's from 3 to 5. I don't know if every organization, because it takes a lot of effort, but some people have a short-term 1 to 3 year planning horizon. And then there's lots of decisions that need to be made throughout the process of engagement. And so you need to understand that, need to understand how the decision-making works in your organization, whether it's very hierarchical or whether it's more collaborative and in its structure and style. One of our former IASP presidents, Lee Crumbaugh, just wrote a book on making decisions based on storytelling of very bad decisions and the results that happen. It's a really good book. Randy actually wrote a review in the Strategic Edge this past summer, I believe, on that. Third activity is develop communication, management, and stakeholder engagement plans. And so one of the things that you might want to look at is graphical facilitation on your teams. To some people learn better or operate better with images. That could be expensive and you may not want to do that, but having a picture tell the story. I wrote an article about visual information maps, which is what the industry is calling it, back about 6 years ago. I experienced it with my US Air Force client, and other clients really like that aspect of taking what people are saying, the kind of the key concepts, the elements of that vision, creating a graphic and putting it all on one sheet of paper. And we'll be talking about those tools in the next iteration as well. There's different communication methods. Today it's multimodal. When I was helping another government client back in the 2012 timeframe, time flies, the admiral knew that in order to reach the younger generation of officers, he needed to have a video. And so when he came on in the morning, started logging on, the first thing that popped up was a video from the admiral describing the new strategy and what's different and what his expectation is for everyone for that. And then he supplemented that with town halls where you got a chance to engage, get those questions. And that was a very effective approach to get people who may not have been happy with the new direction that the organization was going. And then continuously improve. So some of the guidelines. Clearly explain the strategic plan, why it must be implemented. Communications are best if they're two ways and span throughout the organization. In the ProSci methodology, ADCAR, they have leadership action plans or LAPs where leaders know what they should be saying or expect to hear at every point along the process of developing and implementing that change. We believe leaders exist at all levels of the organization. Find them, put them on your stakeholder map, engage them, making sure that those are your strategy advocates for why you're doing that new strategy and how the organization will be better off for that. And then each leader may have their own style. So that's where the leadership action plan comes in to help put things in the voice of you would expect that leader to say, so it sounds authentic. Because if it's not authentic, then people are going to be less reluctant or more reluctant to not listen, turn off the communication aspect. So those are some guidelines. And again, we've got some new tools coming up in the next iteration, since we just focused on key concepts and key activities in this version of 3.0. And I think that's my final slide. We'll turn it over to Pierre. You want me to stop sharing, Pierre, and you want to share?
Yes, please.
Just stop sharing.
Thank you. So, hello, everybody. Do you see my deck?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So, last but not least, we're going to go into the governance activities. So, same procedure for than the past, concept and activities. And of course, as we mentioned, the tools are going to come within the coming months in the new versions of the BOK. So, you can see on the screen, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 key concepts. I will go through them rapidly, but just to give you a hint, and if you want more information, of course, it's available on the BOK. First and foremost, what is governance? Because I realize after all these years, there's a lot of people who don't know what governance is. And it's very simple. It's the system by which organizations are directed and controlled. So if there's no direction and no controlling, it is not governance. It may be management, it may be something else, but it's not governance. So when do governance issues arise? Where whenever an agent must support a principle. So if I have something to do and I need the help of someone to do it for me, there will be a governance issue. And governance refers to, as I mentioned above, systems, practices that an organization puts in place to, you can see 3 bullets, to assign decision-making authorities, to oversee the delivery of its services, and to report on performance. These are the 3 things that governance is required to do. Typically, when we talk about governance, I'm a governance certified by a body in Quebec. They will typically talk about the board. But what's important that you understand is that although the big decisions are left to the board, there must be an alignment to what happens in the company and then the lower level of the company so that the overall governance of the company is sound and well structured. So if we talk about governance, then we've got to talk about the board of directors, which is an elected group of individuals that represent the owners of the organization. They don't represent the managers. They represent the owner. So people who have a stake in the company. They're called board of trustees, board of reasons. They have many names, and they sit on top of the organization. Okay. Nobody has a bigger authority than the board except the actual owners. And in reality, the owners will provide their support or their vote to people in the board of directors to represent them when there are big decisions to be made. So as you can see, they ask in trusteeship for the owners. They have total authority for the activities, although they don't manage the day-to-day. They have the authority for the overall activities of the organization, and they are responsible for identifying owner needs, determining the high-level organizational goals, overseeing the strategy of the organization. We'll get back to that later. To setting policies that are going to guide management activities, and of course, to determining the functioning and culture of the board. So if we talk about the board, we must talk also about management. So when we write management, what we mean is we mean to talk about the people that manage the resources of the company on a day-to-day basis. So management, which are in reality managers, but we call the ensemble of managers of a company, we call the management. They perform 5 key activities, okay? Planning, organizing, staffing, leading, and controlling, okay? Which are not in the purview of the board. They are the purview of management, okay? There are many levels, but at a high level, we define 3 levels in big companies, which are the executives that you know, CEO, COO, CFO, and so forth. Middle managers, which are responsible for either departments, divisions, sections, and lower managers, which are often supervisors or frontline managers or leaders. And amongst all of the managers, the CEO plays the critical role because he's the liaison between the activities, the day-to-day activities of the organization and what's happening at the board level. He is responsible for the operating model of the organization. It's not the board, it's the CEO, but he's going to do this based on the policies that are going to be defined by the board. And he's accountable for the performance and behavior of all the staff. Okay, so then we talk about decision rights, which you must be familiar with Bain and Company, who wrote a lot about that. They have very interesting writing on that. So what are decision rights? If you can look at the bullets, at its most basic, decision rights center on organization rules and practices, whether explicit or implicit, around 3 questions. Number 1, what are the key decisions that must be made? So the first thing you must do is identify the decisions that must be made, or the family of decisions that must be made. Then you must decide the individuals or the groups that are going to make each decision and all the people that are going to be involved in making that decision. There will be some tools on that in the upcoming version of the BOK. And then you must specify the operating processes and the tools that will help support the making of those decisions by the people that were previously identified. That is decision rights. Okay, it's a key component of governance. So why do we talk about governance? Well, it was interesting that there's an article that says, well, what happens if you don't have decision rights? So number 1, decision recommendations may not be made or prepared by the right stakeholders or may be delayed. That means that a lot of problems are going to occur because you're not going to have the right person taking the right decision. Then decision-making may require more effort than necessary and lead to lower quality decision. Same thing. If I know about implementation and I don't have the rights to make the decision and somebody else has the right to make the decision, even though he does not know actually what he's doing or understands the implication of transforming the operating model, that's going to create a problem. Accountability for decision may be difficult to determine, which makes it difficult to give credit to people who are responsible for good and bad decisions. So accountability is very difficult, if not impossible, if you don't have decision rights. Lately, last year or 2 years ago, I did a project with a very big company, which is a very successful company, very good, but they were trying to implement some practices for implementation or strategy transformation, but they had no accountability because it's something they weren't very familiar with. So what happened? Well, the decision rights were flawed. So it took a lot of time to identify what were the problems and to fix the problems. And another thing that may happen is, of course, there can be conflict. So if I'm working with somebody, for example, with Jim, and Jim understands the situation and has inputs, and I do not involve him in making a particular decision, well, that's going to create problems. Number one, I won't make the right decision because I won't have his input. And number two, maybe he's not going to provide me buy-in in the next step because I did not involve him in the decisions. So this is about decision rights. Then policies and guidelines. Well, policies are directives made and maintained by the organization to guide the behavior. They are strict rules. And guidelines, you try to abide them whenever it's possible. So typically, policies can be driven by several forces. For example, the law, regulation, accepted practices. If you work for a bank, so there are a lot of policies, not only based on how transaction can be processed and how the activities of the different department must be segregated because of the law, but also a lot of policies on how to run the general and specific activities of the various departments. So policies are not procedures. Procedures are steps, okay? And policies are not processes because processes are also steps. They're more philosophical in nature, and they generally limit the activities of employees. And as I mentioned before, guidelines, contrary to policies, you try to follow them as much as you can, but there's not such a strict rule to abide by them. Another concept, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is used to describe policies and programs that promote the representation and participation of different groups of individuals, including people of different ages, races, ethnicities, abilities and disabilities, gender, religions, cultures, and sexual orientation. I won't go into the detail of each because I'm sure you're familiar with that, but what's important is that you understand that diversity has to do with differences. You want to favor differences. You want to have differences on your board, differences in your organization. Equity is about parity. So I do not have more benefits than somebody else because of my color, because of my age, because of my gender, and so forth. And inclusion is about respect, about building a respectful and diverse community to foster a welcoming space for people of every gender, every race, every age, and so forth and so on. So the sum of that is what people call diversity, equity, and inclusion. What's important to mention is a lot of people talk about DEI, but if you look at recent studies, some companies are much better than others. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that respect in the coming years. Well, committee is a subset of an assembly and is comprised of individuals elected or appointed to serve, investigate, report on, or act upon a particular matter. Okay, they are central to governance because very often decision rights will be given to a committee. So generally, a committee will be responsible of one or more big decisions, the whole committee, okay? So a committee can be temporary or permanent, okay? And of course, you will give him the authority once you know what you want the committee to do, and you will describe its functioning what you want once you know what you want the committee to do. Not beforehand, after. Okay? And what's an effective committee? Well, it's going to invite input from a lot of people. It's going to generally be self-reliant, and it's generally going to have specific outcomes and rules to follow to to do his actual activities in a proper way to support the governance of the strategy. Finally, reporting. So a report is a document that presents information in an organized format for a specific audience and purpose. So it provides a means to track and analyze the performance and overall health of the organization while allowing users to identify areas for improvement and opportunities for growth. So considering what a report is, reporting is the process of compiling, organizing data into visual, written, or spoken summaries and communicating that data to relevant stakeholders. So reporting is key to governance. Usually you will start the reporting when you formulate and when you execute. And of course, when you do some engaged activities, and then you will bring the result of these reporting activities to the governance bodies so that they can analyze them and make decisions. So reporting is focused on communicating progress, as I mentioned, and identifying barriers. It represents the basis of a culture of accountability. So you will not have accountability, and generally you will have weak decision rights if you do not have reporting tied to it. It often occurs at the functional level, at the department level. And of course, thorough reporting provides the reader with an organizational overview to help quickly assess performance and be agile in the decisions that the organization is going to take. And there are many forms of reporting. Of course, there's some for regulatory reasons, there's some for financial reasons, there's some to follow strategy activities, and so forth and so on. So how are we going to talk about the activities, the governance activities? First, as you know, there are three key activities that form a cycle, right? Of course, there are 5 groups of activities: formulate, transform, execute, but there's also engage and govern. But in the cycle, there's generally formulate, transform, and execute. Not generally, but always, okay? And these are different. So the first thing you have to take into account are these 3 activity groups. And then there are numerous strategy components that you have to take into account. I didn't put all of them, but here are most of them. Number 1, there are financial issues. There's the risks at the enterprise level. And you see OVP, CVP, PVP, and EVP are owner, customer, partner, and employee value proposition. So these are the key components of your strategy. Okay. So when you govern, you have to take into account these components based on the activities in which you are, during which you are executing something. But there's something else also. You have to bear in mind that there are 2 different groups that are involved in governance. There's the board and there's the management. And in reality, there would be a third, which would be professionals, but let's say they have a smaller role, so we did not put them here. So how can we divide that? The first 2 activities are related to strategy formulation. Okay, and of course, there's one related or done by the board, and there's one done by management. And of course, one is the mirror of the other, okay? Because the board must oversee and the management must recommend and report. So basically, when it comes to formulation, well, the management is gonna recommend a stakeholder value propositions. When you see an S, that means it's owner, customer, partner, and employee value proposition. It's going to propose a long-term financial plan. It's going to propose an enterprise risk appetite. And as Jim mentioned, they're going to propose engagement-related plans. Because don't forget, there's always engagement. In whatever activities you do, whether it's formulate, implement, or execute, there's always engagement activities. So the board is going to propose, the management is going to propose, and the board is going to oversee these activities by directing and controlling these activities. So that's why you see they're always the mirror of the other, which is the same thing for transform and the same thing for execute. So this is for the formulation. What about transform? Okay, so when we talk about transformation, don't forget, we talk about identifying the transformation, identifying projects, sequencing projects, and executing the projects to transform the operating model of the company. So everything that has to do with the organizational transformation, the board has to oversee. So the board has to oversee the transformation plan. They have to oversee the budget related to transformation plan. They have to oversee the risks related to the transformation plan, and they have to see all the stakeholder engagement activities related to the transformation plan particularly. So the board oversees, and of course, the management recommends and report on these. And of course, they must manage the actual transformation. So the transformation plan that we discussed last week, right? They're devised by architects, portfolio managers, and so forth, but they are guided and they are managed by the management. So the management oversees the activities of the architect, the project portfolio managers, and so forth. And then they prepare a recommendation, which they propose to the board, and then the board oversees, which means directs and governs all of these activities. So transform organization governance activities all have to do to the transformation plan that we discussed last week. And finally, the execute activities, which, as you can read from the slide, is the exact same logic as the previous two group of activities, but now they relate to the execution of the strategy. So we are not going to talk about the transformation plan. We're going to talk about the operation plans. And we're not going to talk about the risks in transformation. We're going to talk about the risk in operations. And we're not going to talk about the engagement activities related to the transformation, the incentives, and so forth that Jim spoke about for transformation. We're going to talk about the activities related to the operations. And you see the same thing. The board oversees, and then the management, they supervise, and they recommend and report to the board. Okay? And these three family of activities, which represent 8 activities, are very important. And what I've noticed in many boards is they don't do the 8. Very often, they will focus on the first 2 because they're familiar with strategy and so forth. Sometimes they will go and do some of the 6 and 7 and 8, but very rarely will they have a good focus on the transform organization governance activities. And to be able to do that, they have to be involved or at least understand what the transformation plan is, what the operating model is, and so forth and so on, so they can work in collaboration with the management so that all of the cycles can be well embedded one into the other and provide efficient strategy activities. And these 8 activities are not enough because, as Jim mentioned, there's an engagement operating model. As I mentioned the week before, there's a overall operating model of the organization, but there's also a governance operating model, which means how does the firm function just to govern? And if you look in the slides, there are 2 other activities. The first is at the board level. The board has to design, implement, and update the mechanisms and the activities that the board is going to use to govern the strategy. And of course, the management has to do the same thing, but at the level of the overall organization so that it can capture, oversee, and report and manage all of the governance activities related to the formulation, implementation, and execution that they are going to report on to the board. So these were the 10 governance activities for the strategy. Now we get to the Q&A.
So
Pierre, there's a question here for you that follows up on what you were just talking about. Do you have a strong opinion about overlap of members across the boards you cited? None, some, full, question mark.
Oh, do you mean the board or do you mean any committee? Any committee you mean, right?
Greg, do you want to unmute and ask a more expanded question here?
Yeah, I will try to do that. I mean, I was thinking primarily of the boards. And I guess the degree to which a high degree of, having the same members on the three, across the three areas that you had indicated: formulate, transform, and operate. Some would say that it's very important that all the same people are involved in those decisions, and others would say maybe, not so much.
I really like the question. Okay, my opinion on that is when it comes to making a decision, making the board decision, right? Direct and control, it has to be the whole board. Okay. And I think some boards don't do that, and I think it's a flaw. However, gathering all the information, assisting in all the meetings and so forth, you could have definitely some committees in which people are more specialized, for example, in operation or transformation or formulation. That would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you.
So others, if they have questions, you can either put it into the chat function, and Richard will adjudicate those and bring it to our attention. Otherwise, you can just take yourself off mute and ask your question either on engagement or governance or any of the other activities we've covered in this webinar series.
Joyce had a comment earlier. Joyce, you want to unmute and elaborate on that? Okay, not hearing Joyce.
She was really asking about where is risk management as a governance activity, as a governance, and she didn't see it in the concepts. I said you'll get to it, which I thought you did, in the activities as a key factor of boards managing that enterprise risk. And in the federal government here in the U.S., OMB has developed pretty robust enterprise risk management that all the agencies should be following if they're going to avoid some of the pitfalls that Pierre had highlighted at the start of his component talk. Any more questions? I think Richard put it in the chat. Make sure, and I'll get saved and sent, but in the chat, he put the references to a couple of the LBL articles on Lee Cumbraw's decision book, as well as psychological safety. And then he gave the reference of Darrell Connor's burning platform from the mid-1990s. So make sure you check the chat. You can, there's a couple links to use, and hopefully we'll ask those questions. One more. Let's see. So interesting, Pierre, did you see the chat? It's interesting that you brought to the point about lack of focus on the execute. I recall bringing this up at an IASP board some 5 years ago, and I was kind of dissed on it that we are a planning society. Interesting. That's why we wanted to make sure we hit hard on the whole aspect of governance based on the pitfalls and based on the certification programs that Pierre has gone to of the standards that at least Canadian companies are held to. So you're right. We often laugh about how here's a new strategy, and we toss it over for someone else to take care of it because the leadership, not only the board, is going to move on to other issues, of which, shareholder price, if you're, a publicly traded company, it's probably on the top of mind of almost every board meeting. And if you're the CFO, it's on the top of your mind almost every day because you're going to get, what's being done as you execute. So execution can take the form of, if you're not executing well and it's reflected in the market, I think we get the board attention. And that's why I just read today in the Wall Street Journal who got fired today from not focusing on the execution issues that you raised. Do you want to embellish on your question though? Akilish? You're on mute. You're on mute, Akilish.
Sorry, now you can hear me.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yes, it was interesting because, like I said, when I brought it up at IASP meetings, I was the chapter president, and it was like, don't worry about that. That's not something we do. And I said, well, what's the point? And you keep on writing stuff, chuck it over the wall, and it's done. And this year, I got invited back to IASP saying we're forming this new West Coast chapter. And we do want to think about implementing and executing when you come along. So actually hearing that was nice to hear, put that way. And probably like to know more about the focus on this aspect as we move along.
Great, great. Well, have you gotten a copy of the BOK 3.0?
Not yet.
So, like I said, we've got all the key concepts and key activities that Pierre and I reviewed over the last 3 sessions. And we have, we're finalizing the first 50 tools, methods, best practices, approaches in the next iteration. That'll come out probably early January by the time we go through the holidays, Pierre. And then we hope by the annual conference we'll have the next 50 plus tools, templates, activities to help execute on the body of knowledge. So that will be coming out. We already outlined what we're going to be doing. And if there's other things that we miss along the way, we'll add it to the tricks of the trade. So
Again, as you brought up the conference, I'm thinking, since I'll be part of organizing the conference, is having some case studies on the 3 steps from the govern to the transform to the execute, and actually the challenges people have faced.
yeah.
Case study, perhaps you can have a client to bring in, or they can talk about, do a presentation more.
Well, and especially as it relates to the theme, right, that you have. So what people have asked Pierre and I to do is to do a masterclass on this body of knowledge at the conference if we get accepted. And so I've been culling through the written text of how we address some of those issues that are relevant to the theme, because I think it raises a good set of challenges for any organization with that theme, for sure. And case studies would be excellent too. You know, we had, I don't know if you attended the annual conference that we had in Chicago in 2018, but one of the keynotes talked about how they tried to get into a line of business that they had no capability to manage. And so they had to, change their strategy from that and recognize that sometimes you make mistakes, but they had the wherewithal to recover.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for bringing that question up.
Dean, Dean, do you want to jump in, please?
Yeah, this framework Jim and Pierre have shared is really exciting, and I commend both gentlemen for the work that they've done on it. My question concerns one of the ideas that Pierre shared, I think, that spoke to owners of an organization and the responsibility of leaders. I think the context was to represent the owners. However, when it comes to nonprofit associations, there are indications a different sort of approach needs to be taken, especially in the minds of those who suggest no one really owns the nonprofit association, but everybody shares in its successes and failures. So I was curious to know how you might reframe that really good slide in terms of what leaders are responsible for doing in terms of representation when it comes to organizations in the third sector, for example, that don't really have owners.
Can I just take a lead on this first and have you chime in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it does depend on the type of association, whether it's professional or if it's an industry. And some industry associations don't really play as big a role in formulation. They want to be engaged in it, but they kind of leave that, from my experience, they leave that to management. On a professional association like IASP, we've got a very active working board because we don't have employees. We've outsourced. So if you're a working board or if you're in a professional association, you've got different structures necessarily for governing and those activities that you do from an industry association, like say the American Bankers Association, or just pick one. So that's how I would answer that. Pierre, what about you?
Okay, because I've been working on that for like 12 years, okay? And the idea of owner, customer, employee, and partner, the big flaw we saw was everybody kept talking about customer, right? So that's where the idea came from. Okay, back in the days, right? Because obviously customer, Amazon talks about employee and so forth. And then we saw companies like Berkshire, right? It's all about the owner. Okay, and then you look Google, it's all about the employee, right? And then you look about Toyota, and it's all about the partner. So the idea of saying there are stakeholder value propositions, as I mentioned, with an S, that's the key of the message I would convey here, okay? And I wrote owner, which Jim explained very well. He knows it better than me in the nonprofit, but I worked with a city in Europe, and we did the same exercise. And even in a city and in which there was some nonprofit, they still had owners. But very often the owner are also customers, right? So, and it depended who paid tax and so forth. So the idea is there's not only the customer, there are more stakeholders that are involved, number one. And number two, you have to define which are these 4 or 5, depending on the unit of analysis, which in your case, if it would be a nonprofit, we would have to dig in and say, okay, exactly. Well, as Jim said, it's based on that, it would be X, Y, and Z. But the most important, I would say, Dean, and for me, that's the most important. There's not only the customer. Okay, this idea doesn't work anymore. So that would be my compliment to Jim.
There was another question. Richard, you want to read that question that came in on chat?
Yeah. Thank you, Manoj, for the question. And it is, have either of you had a chance to put the framework and activities listed in the BOK 3.0 in actual strategy management assignments?
Yes.
If so, what are your experiences?
Worked very well. I had to understand what the governance structure was for this nonprofit. It was in the agricultural retail space, which is facing lots of different challenges. A lot of politics involved. And so understanding what would play for the board, which are all business owners for the most part, some small, some very large companies around the board, like take Bayer or Monsanto. And then you also had your local or regional ones. And so had to make sure that you brought the whole system into the process. As I wrote an article back in 2012, 2013 about that exact same thing. So we brought in competitors to this nonprofit. We brought in employees. We brought in customers. We brought in former members, current members. We brought in other industry analysts. We brought in all those points of view. So it was about a 50-page document to go into that strategy session, recognizing how the decisions need to be made based on their governance structure and what management would do. So we got, and Richard lived through this experience, we got out of there with a set of vision elements, not going to wordsmith a vision that session. We got mission elements likewise. And the staff, the management was actually going to take that back, massage it, bring it to the board, which they've just done. And so using that governance structure of who's going to be making decisions about what aspect, and this is all funded anyway by their reserve. So definitely using the understanding of the governance model, the funding model, the risks if they didn't do something differently to losing more members and the industry consolidation that's taking place. So we leveraged the all 5 sets of activities to engage all the stakeholders that need to be engaged, work with the structure of the board, make the right decisions, and they were pretty good. They walked out of there pretty happy. And so the client, he's working that magic of the structure to bring this to get approval in December. So a year-long process, but it worked.
I will add my 2 cents to that. Okay, I would say all the activities, or I would say maybe not all, 95% of the activities and the tools in the BOK we've seen or we've used. However, I haven't seen a company that does all of them. Jamais. I've never seen that. People will say they do, but as soon as I start sniffing and looking at actually if they really do it, they don't. Okay. Now, why did we have 5 group of activities? Because that took a lot of work at the beginning. And again, I've been working on that for 10 years. Okay. The problem is people conflate execution with transform. Okay. Still today in 2020. And until this happens, until this is not fixed, I say not all companies are going to use all of the tools and all of the activities because they're going to conflate the two. And they're going to try to use one to do the other. But I think with education and all the stuff that the association is doing now, and all of you people also are helping us diffuse, I hope this will improve in the future. Because if we would say, yes, they're all used and they all work, we wouldn't have an 80% failure rate. That would be false. But my argument, and I'm pretty sure Jim will agree, if you do these in parallel continuously, your chances of improving are significantly increased. That would be my add-on.
So we had a concept in there, a statement that someone wrote a book a couple of years ago that talked about in the nonprofit space that donors are really kind of play a role of owners since they're giving their monies. And so my comment is citizens provide money for government to operate. So with their customers, their employees, and they provide funding. So I think those are interesting concepts. And that's why we focus on adding that whole section on governance from those perspectives and the different value propositions, because it's not only a shareholder value proposition. So if we don't have any more questions, I want to turn it over to Randy. If you want to share your screen, Randy, and just close us off for the series.
I'll share. It's fine.
No, you got the wrong slide. Oh, no, yeah, okay, good. So Randy.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre, Jim, Richard, Dean, for a great webinar series. I hope this has been of value to all of you that have attended. We've given this a lot of thought and feel really good about what BOK 3.0 has become and is becoming. As I've mentioned, we're building all this into our courses, our 10-week class that'll start again in February, as well as the book that goes along with the course and our self-study program. If there's anything you need, please reach out to us. Doug Maris, his email and phone number are there. You can reach out to me or Richard. We'll be happy to engage with you at any time. So on behalf of LBL Strategies, and I have to say IASP because we are in this together, thank you all very much.
Thank you all.